Good morning, and thank you for joining the American Society for Engineering Management, ASEM, and UMBC's Engineering and Computing Education Program, ECEP, for this, our second webinar in a series exploring diversity, equity, and inclusion in the design and management of technological systems. And today's seminar or webinar is titled Diversity in Robotics, the Black in Robotics Initiative. I am Woodrow Winchester, the moderator and coordinator for this series. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. The session is being recorded and the link will be made available. So we will let you know when that link is available of this recorded session. And we do ask, in terms of saving on bandwidth, if you would mute yourself, and I believe I was able to do that. I think I muted everyone, but if you would turn off your cameras, would greatly appreciate that. And also, I will be kind of monitoring the chat box. So for questions, so we're going to use chat for questions, and we will allocate the last 10 minutes for Q&A. The series continues. Again, this is in a series, which we're really excited about. It continues on February the 18th, where we'll have Annie Jean-Baptiste, who's actually the author of Building for Everyone. You got to get this book, Expand Your Market with Design Practices, from Google's product inclusion team. So we're really excited to have her on the 18th. And we'll be concluding this series on the 25th of March with Rosalind Byrne, who's the director of the Center for Engineering and Society at the National Academy of Engineering. Again, we invite you to explore the professional engineering programs at UMBC, and we also invite you to join the American Society for Engineering Management and check out some really interesting continuing education opportunities that we do have available in terms of professional credentialing, and also some great opportunities that we have in support of our student members. So with that being said, just want to give a quick shout out to my colleague who's actually coordinating the webinar series for our academic partnership, our student members. We will be having a webinar on the 27th of January titled Careers in Product Development. So that insight has been posted on the homepage for ASEM. So please check that out and register for this, webinar. And again, not only open to students, but professionals as well. So with that being said, I am so honored and humbled. I do apologize, just had a couple technical glitches there. Humbled and honored to introduce Dr. Ayanna Howard. Ayanna Howard is currently the Linda J. and Mark C. Smith Professor and Chair of the School of Interactive Computing at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She holds a faculty appointment in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering and serves on the board of directors for the Partnership on AI at Autodesk. Dr. Howard's career focuses on intelligent technologies that must adapt to and function within a human-centered world. Her work, which encompasses advancements in artificial intelligence, assistive technologies, and robotics, has resulted in over 250 peer-reviewed publications in a number of projects, from healthcare robots in the home to AI-powered STEM apps for children with diverse learning needs. To date, her unique accomplishments have been highlighted through a number of awards and articles, including highlights in USA Today, Upscale, and Time Magazine, as well as being recognized as one of the 23 most powerful women engineers in the world by Business Insider and one of the top 50 US women in tech by Forbes. Indeed, an honor to have you, Dr. Howard. In 2013, she also founded Zyrobotics, which develops STEM educational products to engage children of all abilities. Prior to Georgia Tech, Dr. Howard was a senior robotics researcher and deputy manager in the office of the chief scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So not only a researcher, but a practitioner. She has also served as the associate director of research for the Institute for Robotics and Intelligent Machines, chair of the Robotics Ph.D. program, and the associate chair for faculty development in ECE at Georgia Tech. And I must add, on March 1, Dr. Howard will join The Ohio State University as Dean of the College of Engineering. So without further introduction, it is indeed my honor and pleasure to turn this over to Dr. Ayanna Howard. So just give me 1 second as I give her my screen.
So what I'm going to do with this time that I have with you is really, my focus is twofold. So one is to talk about a new organization called Black in Robotics, which is really a focus on diversifying robotics, but it's a little bit more than that. But in order to get to that point, I want to walk you through the story of why I think this is important as a roboticist. So I've been doing robotics now for almost my entire life, which is interesting. And one of the things about being a roboticist is that, back in the day, and I'll talk a little bit about this, robotics was, it was cool, it was nice, but people didn't really understand it because you didn't see robotics or a robot in your day-to-day interactions. You see it in the movie, science fiction, but it really didn't mean that much. And now it's become a lot more pervasive. And one of the things about any technology, when it becomes pervasive, if it doesn't reflect the beauty and the diversity of the world, then we really have to rethink about how we're deploying, how we're building out the technology. And so I kind of want to walk you through that story with actual facts and thoughts about how this has evolved into this new initiative, and then really talk about the initiative and how it links to just making a stand and doing all of these things. And so, as was mentioned, I've done a lot of things. I've been a lot of places. Again, I started off my career in government at NASA JPL, and moved into academia, but I've also done startups and companies and things like that. And so one of the things about being a person who would be considered one of a interesting, diverse set is that you always have to talk about your credentials. And so what does that mean? It means that when you come into the room, there's always an assumption that who are you, do you really belong? And so, as a roboticist and as a Black female roboticist, I always show my credentials just so that you really understand that, as I always tell my students, I have creds, right? And that's the foundation, because then it allows you to talk about the things that are important to really change that perception of why. But that also means that as we traverse through this world, we have labels. And so this goes to this aspect of thinking about what is this role of diversity and DEI. And so one of the things about people is that we label others. And it's not a fault of, an individual, it is what we do. And there's reasons behind this, is actually, if you look at and interested in neuroscience, that there's reasons why we like to compartmentalize. It actually allows us to go through the world in as much of an optimal way as possible. And so because of that, what happens is we default a lot of times to the labels that others bestow. And so one of the things about this aspect and how it links to Black in robotics is that if you think about all of the labels that are going to be applied to you, or the labels that you are applying to others, the best thing that you can do is choose the labels that resonate with you, because you're going to be labeled many, 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 many things. All of us are, whether we're a manager, whether we're a new manager, whether we're a CEO, someone is going to label. And so really it's about thinking of the labels that people are bestowing, which one resonates with you. And so the three labels that resonate with me that I always talk about, and one of them I want to make a special note of. So it was mentioned, 23 of the most powerful women engineers in the world. I kind of like that because it shows a world perspective. So it's not just a US centric, it's actually the world, which is larger than, say, the US. So that also identifies me as an engineer, right? So at the end of the day, I'm a roboticist, I'm an engineer, I'm a computer scientist, right? And so that is I am technical at my core. I can geek out with the best, but I also understand people, which it makes it that I can understand culture, community, organizations, and management in these aspects. But the one that I want to talk about that really links to this whole aspect of diversity DEI. So a label that was bestowed was the nation's most senior African-American female roboticist in higher education. They actually think I'm probably the most senior African-American female roboticist, period. But of course, sometimes there might be a senior roboticist that is no longer here or moved out of the field. But basically, that means that I'm old, which I didn't like, but what it allows me to do is to basically make a statement, which is that if I'm the most senior roboticist, then what have we been doing wrong? Because if we look at science, we look at technology, we look at all the things that are out there, we should have a long history of, thinking about technology management, thinking about the technology we deploy. And if I'm the most senior, that means that we have a huge gap that was before. And so the question then is how do we fix that? How do we fix that gap so that this is not a statement? And so when I, one day again will be the most senior, I'm 80, not the age that I am now. And so that really says that we have a gap. It's an identifiable gap. And it really is in our best interest as a society, as a community, as technologists to really lean in and ensure that this is fixed. And so let me talk a little bit about this aspect of, why is this important? So I mentioned, I've been doing robotics now almost my entire life. And in my first career, I was at NASA, at JPL, and I was responsible for thinking about future Mars missions. How do we navigate long range traversals? How do we do this so that we optimize the science? And we had just landed Sojourner on Mars. And so the world was open. Sojourner, just so you know, it was a very appropriate name, but when the rover had landed, it had very simple intelligence, very simple logic. It was really, and we call it an experiment. And so the concept is when that happened, it opened up the possibilities of what could we actually do then? If we can send rovers, we had the intellect, we had the process, we could do this. Well, what should we do when we actually get to this land, this promised land of exploration? And so my task was to think about navigation in that regard. And there was other kind of teams, and I was this future vision looking. And so the way that I thought about it was, well, we hadn't done this before. We hadn't done long range traversal on another planet. But we had done it here. And so what I decided to do as an engineer, as a roboticist, is to go to the experts who were the human experts, who were the scientists, and said, look, if you could go to Mars and land on Mars, and we could bring you back, by the way, what would you do? How would you explore? What is the science that you would extract? How would you even figure it out if you've never even been to this place? And looking at how they modeled and how they traversed, I would take that. And so one of the things about how this fits into diversity is that every scientist has a way, right? Just like every technologist, there's one outcome, but they do it, and the process of getting there is different for everyone. And so one of the things I learned very early on was that scientists thought differently. They interacted differently. You would have scientists, they had the same label, astrobiologists, and you think, oh, they're trained the same. But no, everyone had a different way of thinking about the science. You had some scientists that would traverse and look at rocks. So they would go one rock to another rock to another rock. They would pick it up and lick it and do things like that. You had another scientist who would map things out and kind of do a trail and think about, okay, this is the best path. But what it meant was that as a technologist, I had to look at the diversity of experiences and the diversity of practices and figure out how do I integrate that all together to get the best solution. And so that's when I first realized and started to think about the fact that we as people are very unique, and each of us brings something to the table in order to create a solution. And as a technologist, my role as managing the project was to figure out how to do that so that there wasn't just one way of doing something. But of course, because there's so many diverse ways of doing it, how do you ensure that the types of things that are at the interface make sense? Now, I fast forward to at Georgia Tech, still doing science-driven robotics, but now the world had shifted. The world had shifted because robotics and AI was becoming much more of a reality. And so before, when I was at NASA, it was about taking scientists, getting their information, treating them as an expert, and then taking that and putting it and modeling it for the rover. But now we were at a stage where we needed more. It was this aspect of figuring out how do you have these systems, these intelligent systems, working with people in the same space. And so now the challenge was not just how do we take information from a diverse set of individuals and try to come up with a solution, but now is that solution now also has to interact with a diverse set of users. And so this becomes more complicated because so now it's not just about the expert knowledge having to work with diversity, but also that the solution itself has to work with diverse users. And both of the aspects of how you define diversity is different, right? And one aspect is about experts. They already kind of know what they're doing. And the other, you might have basically novices. They're not used to working with the systems. And so you have to think about this a little bit differently. But it also meant that at the core of everything I thought about as a technologist was I had to think about the fact that we had to incorporate these aspects of diverse users, diverse thinkers, and these aspects, which again is interesting. And so what does this lead to where I think about technology, where I think about Black in robotics, and how I think about the intense need we have to think of and the importance of this aspect of diversity and inclusion. So a well-known quote by Turing, and this is back in the 1950s, which was, how do you know if, a machine is intelligent? And it really is the concept of, how do we know when we have smart, intelligent machines, right? Like, what is our metric for evaluating this? You can't open up a box and be like, oh yeah, it looks like a human brain. How do you, maybe you quiz it, can they get a bachelor's of science or a PhD, right? And so there was this concept that it really wasn't, the metric for deciding whether a machine was intelligent was not whether we can quiz it and evaluate it, but it's whether that as it's interacting with a person, it can act as intelligently. And so there was a lot of tests that would basically try to figure out, if a human was working with another human and a human was working with another machine, could you not distinguish between the two, right? Like that's the holy grail, because you think about it, when we design technology, we're designing it for a purpose. And if it can achieve that purpose, then it's achieved its goal. And if the purpose is to have a human function, if the purpose is to augment human capability, and the human believes that it's doing that, then we define it as intelligent. And so that's true. But I really have thought about this over the years. And I think because I'm interested in people and we look at humans as both the experts and the users, it really isn't focused on how smart these machines are or whether we can mimic them. It really is the fact, and where we are today is not deciding if a machine, can be intelligent as a human being, is really, can a machine be as biased as a human being? And so why do I say that? So the fact is that as we design these machines, and I mentioned, going and looking at the scientists and extracting their information, the fact is as people, we are biased, right? It's inherent in us. It's part of our DNA. It actually allows us to function. And so there are some positives about being biased. It actually helps us survive and live and survive to 80 years old. If we didn't have these interconnections of bias, we would probably have killed off our offspring long time ago. And so the concept is then, given that we are biased, given that these machines and these robots are learning from us, really it's that the machines are inheriting our biases. And the concept is how do we ensure that as these machines inherit our biases, they inherit the things that are positive and good for us. For example, being able to recognize a friendly face in the crowd, because that's a form of bias in how we allocate information in our brains. But then it also allows us to, again, discriminate against others. And so how do we have the good of us being these unique creatures, but also mitigate the negatives of actually having this bias process that's then being used? And so when we think about robots and bias, it's about, thinking about what is bias and how do we know that it's even present? And when I say that is the bad bias, not the good bias that allows us to learn and adapt and augment our own capability. And really, when we think about robotics and the role of us as technologists and managing the technology, it's the fact of, the holy grail is, does this bias lead to injustice? So if the bias exists, it's going to have bias because we as people have biases and these machines are learning from us. But if it leads to injustice, we need to really think about that. And of course, this leads into, and if that injustice is resident and embedded in our robotics and AI algorithms, how do we figure out how to mitigate it? How do we figure out how to remove it, and things like that? And so just a little bit, I am a technologist, I'm a researcher, and so also have to do a little bit of grounding of how this is and the case. And so we know, and this is both in my research as well as in other researchers, some in Black and robotics, others worldwide, is that when people interact with these robotic systems, these AI systems, they actually will defer their opinions, they will defer their decision-making processes to these machines. And the reason, and there's a number of reasons why, primarily is because remember these robotic systems, they are acting, they are modeling human interactions, human-human interactions. And so as a human, when you're interacting with these machines, you have this familiarity. It's working like it's supposed to. It feels exactly the same. And so we tend to defer to these agents because one, they have been modeled based on our interactions, so they understand us. But then we also have this deference of, and it's also intelligent, right? So if I go back to this Turing aspect, as specialists and designers of these technologies, we figured out how to make these systems intelligent enough that people will believe them. But then we also have to think about the fact that they are also, they've modeled us and they modeled interactions. And so both of them, it means that time and time again, we see that individuals, humans, users will defer their judgments to these machines. And so again, that's good if you have a machine that's always right, that has been able to mitigate bias. The problem happens then is if these machines are designed where no one examined what type of biases are there. Is there any injustice in the system? What's going on? And therefore, when individuals are deferring their decisions, they're also deferring it to the biases, which also means that some of these biases can be augmented. And so why is this a problem? So the reason is because there's been an adoption of AI and robotics. This has been accelerated because of the pandemic. If I was going to talk about this, a year ago, I would have said, oh, we still have about 5 years before we really have to worry. And because of the pandemic, because of this need to continue functioning as a society, but we are limited by our human interactions, there's been a replacement of human functions so that we still maintain our functionality as a society, but we do it safely. And so there's been this increase in a lot of the functions that I would have thought would have taken at least 5 years. They're being deployed now. And so this is a problem because they're being deployed, they still have bugs, they still have errors, they still have biases, but they have a direct need. And so now we're at the question of these systems are out there, they're being used, they're being deployed. Okay, we need to also now fix them. And so if you think about, the holy grail of being a manager and developing technology, and you're sending something out to beta, right? And you're like, if you think about beta, it's usually a small user, they can give you feedback, you're fine with it. You iterate before you do a final release. Well, now we're at the stage where we just released a bunch of beta software thinking it was a small user group, and all of a sudden the world needed it. And so beta become very immediately a release one without that nice ability to take the feedback and fix the biases and fix anything. And so this has become a problem because we're now seeing where the issues are, and we don't necessarily have all the solutions to fix them or to ensure that the systems aren't unjust or provide some aspect of injustice. And so if I think about this, why is this an issue? So we know that machines are influenced by their creators. And I mentioned earlier about how we have, when I was at NASA and I brought scientists together and they were all, quite different in how they approach science. And my role as a technologist and managing the project was to figure out how to interact and interface and get their information as a coherent whole, even though there was differences in a unified solution. And so the fact is that these machines are influenced by their creators. As a technologist, as a project manager, I'm thinking about how to do this. I'm the one that's creating and trying to poke at it and figure this out. And I can choose to have decided that, I like the way that this one scientist does it, or this collection of scientists do it because they all do it this and it's familiar with me. And I'm just going to disregard the way that the other scientists do. As a manager, I have that choice because I'm managing the project. And so when we think about these robotic systems and these AI systems that are being deployed, the technologists and the managers and project managers of the technology of requirements are also the ones that are influencing what happens. And so these machines are not just, we would call value neutral. They aren't value neutral because as the creators, we are actually informing the development process and we are kind of mapping what these systems look like. And so what that means is that it's just as important to think about this aspect of bias in our technology, in our developers, and ensuring that we have a diverse team. But it's also important for us as managers of the development and these projects to think about the biases that are resident in ourselves, because we are the ones that ultimately decide on the parameters. We are the ones that decide on the team. And so it's just as important to think about it at the management level as it is in the technology level. And so really quickly, some of the things that have occurred that have accelerated. One, and I'm just going to talk about this one because it's been in the news quite a bit, which is around facial recognition. And so facial recognition and the biases in that are not unique. They are not, oh my gosh, what happened? How did this happen? The biases in facial recognition algorithms has been in existence since the algorithm started in the infancy trying to do it. But a couple of ones that I guess made the community realize that we needed to think about this a lot more. And I'm going to talk about them. Really kind of swung the needle of folks pivoting some of their research to look at this. So one was that there was a set of researchers that looked at, can you use our facial expressions, our facial images to identify or distinguish between criminals and non-criminals? And so you think about, well, it's a research project, but, some of the thinking process about, criminals versus non-criminals, as has also seeped into predictive algorithms and criminal recidivism algorithms. And so even though you could think of it as, oh, it's just a research project, these things have seeped into, and as I said, accelerated into the real world. And so in that regard, they basically showed how they could extract information from images, train a deep neural network to distinguish between, I can look at your image and I can recognize whether you are a criminal or not criminal. And they actually received pretty good accuracy, about 90-something% accuracy. And just to poke, it was actually not correct. The science was actually inaccurate because they kind of, spoiler alert, you can read the paper. They had trained on basically mug shots versus, profile business pictures. And so, as you know, mug shots, I've never seen a beautiful mug shot, but I have seen really nice profile pictures when you want a job, right? And so really the question is they were looking at the differences between, smiling and not smiling, mug shot where you're kind of, I'm kind of gross, you can't smile versus, I want to look very professional and things like that. And so if you fast forward, like, okay, that was, obviously unbelievable. You fast forward, there was another set of algorithms where another set of researchers said that they could distinguish sexuality or sexual identity, again, from photos. And so in this regard, they scraped dating sites and they could identify individuals that basically in the entire community, LGBTQ plus, as well as heterosexuals, at about 80% accuracy, 91% if you added in women and men. And so again, they looked and see, what's going on. That was a research project. But yet we see that this has been deployed into airport systems, the same algorithms that were used to identify criminal versus non-criminal, the same algorithms that are used to identify a sexual identity have creeped into some of our surveillance systems and things like that. And so think about it as a manager. You're designing a technology, facial recognition, which could be good if you're trying to protect, but it could also be used for bad. And then the concept then is well, given that these systems are out there, given that they're deployed, is it really that difficult to fix it? And I will tell you that it's actually not easy. And so one of the things as you think about managing this technology, it is not an easy thing to think about how do you mitigate the bias. It is not easy to think about how do you ensure that these systems don't introduce injustice? And it's actually difficult. So as an example, there was a tool that was released by Google that labeled Black individuals as gorilla. They basically removed that tool and released the photo app. And so now you can't label anything as gorillas, right? So that's how they fixed it. They basically disregarded the problem. If you look at some of the tools where they had gendered labels, like, I see a woman, I see a child. They recently have removed the ability to have gendered labels. And so there's some argument of like, well, we shouldn't have gender labels anyway. And then there's some argument that says, yes, we actually should, because we have not fixed our own biases. And so if we don't at least lean into it and try to fix it, we're basically not admitting that there's a problem. And so all of these biases are present. All of them are there because we as developers and again, as managers have these biases. And so as we think about this, just kind of there are studies to show that it's in us. And so it's not that, oh, I'm biased, this is bad. It's actually the way that we're structured. It's actually the way that we learn. It's actually the way that makes us survive. And so we have elements of, we call it in-group versus out-group. And so if you belong to a certain gender, you are more likely to have an affinity to others in that gender. If you belong to a certain race or ethnicity, you are more likely to have an affinity to that race and ethnicity. And it goes on for age and so on and so on. And again, it has nothing to do with, us being explicitly biased. It actually has to do with our learning experiences. And so what that means then is, as we're developing this technology and we're managing these projects and managing these engineers, we have to think that this is inherent, right? And some call it implicit bias, but it's inherent in the way that we think. And it's up to us as managers to actually look and really think about the fact that it's a fact, and therefore we need to think about it more broadly. And so we have it here. And so I'm going to talk about Black in robotics and what does this mean. And so recently, myself and Dean Isbell wrote an article looking at the diversity in artificial intelligence and robotics, and we called it the invisible men and women problem. Because a lot of the things that we see in the technologies that are being released, it's that it's released, and it's only after the fact that someone says, hey, do you know that it doesn't work the right way for certain groups of people? And so the question then becomes is, why is it that the management team didn't even think that this was going to be a problem? Why is it that the managers didn't think about the fact that there are certain cases you should test for? And so we call it this invisible men and women problem, because when you do not have individuals that are present in the room, given that we all have these biases, again, own race, own gender, own age, it also means that we don't necessarily recognize when individuals are in the room, right? Because it just isn't part of our thinking process. It's just not part of our experience. And so really the problem that we think about in terms of creating technology isn't the fact of, designing biases into the technology. It's the fact that we don't even recognize that these biases exist until they're released, until they're out there. And so this leads me to talking about Black in robotics. So what happened was this came out again, basically in 2020. And right after we had all the civil unrest with George Floyd, and there was a couple of panels about robotics and racism. And after one of those panels, I didn't participate. It was a bunch of speakers. Some of the co-founders of Black in Robotics were on there. I got called and said, you need to look at the recording, just like this one, because I think it's going to be interesting to you. And the things that I heard and the questions that were asked, and this aspect of, I'm the only one on the team. How do I have a voice? How do allies have voices if they see something? All of it was very interesting. And it was very apparent that there was an invisibility problem with respect to roboticists and and AI developers and this aspect of diversity. And so what happened was, and I'm just going to kind of fast forward. So what happened was getting together a group of kind of not only just senior roboticists, but also individuals that have been in this space to really think about, well, how do we resolve this aspect of diversity in robotics and AI? How do we resolve this aspect of being invisible because there are so few that are present? How do we ensure that companies and managers and industry as well as universities really lean into this? And the concept is that we have to start this somehow. And so that's just how Black in Robotics came about. I will tell you, I'm a technologist. I design robots. I program robots. I develop AI algorithms to make my robots smart. I did not consider myself someone who would co-found an organization that looks at this aspect of advocacy, right? Like I advocate for my own group, I advocate for my individual unit, my university, my company, but really thinking about it broader was not something I signed up for, right? I signed up, I have a PhD in electrical engineering. I signed up to do engineering work. But what I realized was that because robotics was becoming so pervasive, because AI was being deployed, that if we weren't part of the solution, then we were also, contributing to the problem. And so Black in Robotics, the mission is to really bring together those who identify as Black, African-American, as well as African, Caribbean, the diaspora, to bring together the researchers, professionals, students in robotics to, one, provide a community so that if you are the only one in the room and you're asking how do you have a voice, that there is a community of others who can come together and support each other. But it's also to advocate for more diversity, inclusion, and equity within the organizations and providing the tools and the resources in order to do that. It's also to ensure that when we design these robotic systems, that this invisibility aspect goes away. And so the only way that we can do this is to ensure that not only as roboticists, diverse individuals are at the table, but it also means that everyone who's at the table recognizes that we have an issue and recognizes that, hey, I'm at a table, there are no X, right? Or there's no Y. We need to think about this and really to amplify. And so Black in Robotics really represents this global network of not just Black roboticists, but also allies and organizational sponsors to really contribute to, enhancing this division and ensuring that there is inclusion and equity in robotics. Because robotics and AI is for the world, and the world looks amazingly diverse. And so we need to ensure that the creators of this diversity is really represents the world. And that's who we are. And so really quickly, one of the leadership team was very strategic. It represents academics. It represents, again, industry, it represents organizations such as nonprofits as well as students, because again, trying to think about what are the different kind of organizational entities, stakeholders in this, we need to make sure as much as possible to have that representation on the leadership team. And so this is actually the co-founding team that works together to really drive this organization forward. And then we have sub-teams of, an ally subgroup that has a chair and an outreach subgroup that has a chair to really expand so that everyone has a voice to ensure that we are moving forward. And so kind of the objectives, one is, of course, doing things like this, talking about the reason for DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and grounding it a lot in terms of the history and the progress in robotics and AI, of course, the community building, advocacy, accountability, and this empowerment aspect. And so really, I just want to talk about three of the pillars that Black in Robotics stands for. So one is community. And so what does community look like? Community is really about this whole aspect of not only sponsorship, mentoring, but also leaning into doing social media. So in terms of community, for example, we've started our first chapter of Black in Robotics in Boston. The launch will be sometime in February, March, where we have a corporate sponsor that's giving us space and resources to really provide a community space and a forum for the ones in the Boston regional area that are in robotics, in AI, to come together and do not only networking, but also outreach. The other is advocacy and holding not only ourselves accountable, but our organizations accountable about ensuring that we remove this aspect of invisibility so that everyone is there talking about possible solutions. And so this aspect of advocacy, and then not only advocating, but also ensuring that we have the metrics for accountability to say, are we doing this correct? And if not, what can we do to better and move the needle even more so? And we have a bunch of different activities. So a little bit of metrics. So we technically launched officially in September. And it's been grassroots efforts since then, and it's not even been 6 months. We've grown to about, actually it's more than 180, it's about 200, over 200 members. And members are, given information, either identified as Black or as an ally. We have a whole nother membership in terms of companies and sponsors in that regard. Number of followers, 2,500 that actively follow us, actively engage with us, and things like that. And so again, if you think about this as a grassroots efforts, a number of us coming together and saying, this is something we need to do in this space of robotics and AI, and growing that and being very open and transparent about what is the role, why is it we need this, has been an amazing experience. And one of the things is that as a leader in technology development, as a manager of these groups, I think it's important for all of us to really lean into this aspect, really embrace this concept, because again, we are designing technology for the world. We are designing technology for these users. And the fact is that our user base, any technology we design, our user base, we want it to be globally accepted, because of course that means our product is being used and deployed in a wise way. And so really thinking about how do we do this? How do we do this effectively really involves us thinking about this aspect of DEI. And so as a manager, kind of leaving you with two messages is we need to focus on people, i.e. people are diverse. The range of people are diverse. In that diversity, we all have our own biases, and biases by themselves are not bad. And so as a manager, the question is how do we take these special characteristics of each of our individual team members, of our technologies, and really try to figure out where is the intersection so we can create a unified solution. And so it's about making sure that we focus on people as core of our technology in this aspect. And then the other thing is to ensure that we focus on this element of diversity, the fact that everyone brings something to the table. And we need to ensure that we don't have the invisibility problem for any one group of people, because when you have that, it means we release technology, we lead technology. As a project manager, we're going to release this as a beta because someone is going to identify that something doesn't work for a certain group of people. And so really making sure that we are conscious of this issue of invisibility. And so hoping that with Black in Robotics, and again, I told you about the motivation, is that we are doing that for the space of robotics and AI as it intersects with robotics and diversity and this aspect. And I think as managers, it is our responsibility. It's not someone else's. And again, I'm a technologist. I love playing in my sandbox, right? Like that's what I find joy in. But I also know as a leader in this space and thinking about development and thinking about my projects, it is our responsibility. We can't just play in our sandbox and create cool things and create cool technologies, but we need to ensure that when we do it, that we address the responsibility of releasing tools, technologies to the world, in the world that is beautiful and diverse. And so with that, we are going to open it up for any questions you might have, and want to thank you for listening with this time that I'm here with you talking. And I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Howard, for that very provocative talk. I mean, we need part 2, 3, 4, 5 of this conversation as we begin to kind of, better understand our responsibility and acting accordingly. I love how you ended the talk this morning. So what we're going to do in terms of questions, there were a number of questions that came up in the in chat. Let's see here. Let's see what we've got. And for some reason, I lost a couple questions. Okay. So Dr. Howard, I'm going to work from bottom to top. So hopefully we'll get through most of the questions. Is Black in Robotics part of a university or a standalone nonprofit? Could you tell us a bit about how it was funded and when it first started and how it is being funded now?
It is a standalone organization. It is not affiliated with one university at all or one organization. And so the focus is, ideally international, but we are focused on at least resolving or fixing a lot of the problems in the US, only because most of the companies right now in robotics and AI are housed in the US. And this aspect of Black and this aspect of injustice is, we all thought it was a US-based problem. We now know it's worldwide, but a lot of the root of it comes from here. And so that's it. In terms of funding, we have, we officially were founded, I guess, in September as a nonprofit. We're now going through the process of, getting our 501c3 and all of that. So that's an ongoing process. The way that we're funded is we have currently corporate sponsors, and what they're doing is they're actually funding events specifically. So Amazon has funded us or funded the events, as well as Toyota Research Institute has funded efforts in terms of video series to showcase what we call Black excellence and things like that. And so that's really kind of what we're doing in other kind of organizations. And it's all grassroots. So what's interesting is that these companies have come to us and said, we like to fund, we heard you're doing this, we like to fund it. And we're like, sure, send them the kits, buy the kits and send them, because we don't want any transactions coming through us quite yet, right? And it's worked out very well.
Oh, that is phenomenal. Another question, what are your thoughts about AI-based recruitment tools?
Oh, so I'm going to start by saying that the recruitment tools are better than human recruiters. So I'm going to start off by saying that, right? And so if you compare them against, and when I say that is if you actually had a really nice set of diverse recruiters, they would be better. But the fact is we don't, right? And so given we are at the state, this is what we have, the AI-based recruitment tools are better. The problem is that they still introduce aspects of bias because they are trained on historical data. So as an example, some, the top technology companies, if you look at their representation of gender, as an example, or of, Black, Hispanic, LGBTQ+, all disability, their numbers are low. And so if you're training data based on those numbers, small sample sizes, you're just going to reinforce. And so what I find works best is if you use those recruitment tools as a baseline, but then you have recruiters that are looking at it with understanding that there's bias. Like you come to it and it's like, we know there's bias, fact. You actually get a better outcome. And so this is a hybrid AI human system is the best ones I've seen to at least mitigate the bias using humans that are trained to recognize this.
Yeah, it's a really amazing in that space. We've seen a lot of, as you've articulated, some great positives in terms of the ability to actually, identify candidates that may not normally would have been identified for given sorts of positions in terms of what the algorithm is looking for, how it's been structured and designed, but there can be a counter to that as well. Dr. Howard, there was more of a comment here, but I definitely want to get your perspective on this because this is really intriguing and it really kind of builds on the latter part of the conversation. Bring humility, understanding that no one knows the underlying reality. So listen to others objectively and share information without being punished, building trust so that collectively we gain a better understanding of the underlying reality by acknowledging the perspective of others as well as our own. And this came in kind of towards the beginning of your talk as you were talking about, and this was such an intriguing notion I found as well, and it's really beginning to help me think about some things in the context of work that I'm doing in terms of really that there's diverse ways of doing, and we have to be cognizant and mindful of that in design and also in the design decisioning and in our work in terms of developing these sorts of technological solutions. Then the solutions have to be able to work with that diversity. So really would like some further insight and perspective on that more philosophical notion.
It's
I think I'm
true.
becoming a philosopher in my old age.
Yeah, no, it's true. And so this is the thing that it's hard. So one of the problems, and I mentioned the invisibility problem. One of the problems is that when we don't recognize our own biases, right? Especially if all of us have the same biases, and that's the invisibility problem. If I'm, in a group of, X individuals and we're all electrical engineers and roboticists, we might forget that, the social scientist is missing, right? Because we're like, oh, we're all vibing. I'm like that human robot interaction. I know right? Like we don't even recognize that someone's missing from the room. But what we find is that there are ways to try to pull this out. As an example, they have found that when you have teams, say it's, I'll say all engineers are a homogeneous team. If you deliberately put someone in the team that's slightly different, what happens is it actually fires up a different part of your brain. So you start thinking about other differences, right? So if I'm in a team, say I'm, not that this ever happens. So I'm in a team of all women engineers, right? And if I suddenly put a male engineer in, it makes me start to think about, oh, you know what? We don't have someone here who can talk about disabilities. Oh, we don't have someone here, right? It's like a trigger. Because now what happens is, so think about it. It's that you have this pebble, it disturbs your thinking process. And so as soon as you have this disturbance, it basically permeates. And so you start thinking about other disturbances. And so it's actually fascinating. It's just why when you have a conversation, one person can say something like, hey, have you thought maybe we should raise salaries? And it'll shift the entire conversation, right? And so this is actually, there's science behind this. They've studied this phenomenon, but it also works for thinking about solutions and technologies, about introducing that kind of anomaly, introducing, think of simulated annealing, you introduce a little bit of friction, it actually helps the team think better.
Thank you so much for that. And I think we've got time for one more question. This is a very interesting question, which really gets into, again, on a philosophical sort of level as well. Is there a discussion in this area about the morality and legality of developing technology, AI in particular, when it has the potential for injustice or discrimination? How is it being addressed?
Yes, there is a ton of stuff that's, I would say maybe within the last 2-ish years that has focused on this. In fact, there's a conference called We Robot. I'm going to highlight it because I'm on the organizing committee that happens every year that actually looks at these things. It looks at this aspect of the law, legality, not necessarily morality, but like the legal aspects of some of these, because our laws are archaic and they don't quite match what's going on in reality. Right. And so there's discussions about what does this mean? At least in the US, there's a bunch of potential bills that are trying to be passed about, laws and regulations and what can and can't be done and things like this, because again, deployed, being used in systems that are impacting our civil liberties. And there aren't really the right laws to protect us as a public. Right. And so we're playing a little bit of catch up. unfortunately, which means that we're going to see some issues, as you know, for example, Detroit with the facial recognition algorithm, right? Like his only recourse is like civil, right? To sue for money. So again, we're catching up. But what's interesting is that we will be catching up. It's just a process.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and it's so much work that needs to happen as you've articulated in that area. And just as a final thought, this whole notion, when you say catching up in terms of understanding consequences, and I really enjoyed the fact that you gave us the reality around why we are experiencing some of these sorts of problems, because now we see the potential benefit of this technology. It hasn't been fully vetted, but then we want to deploy it because there's a need. So there's catch up in that regard as well. So what can we do, specifically speaking from an educational sort of perspective, to kind of foster and develop that more quote unquote consequential thinking in technologists and engineers?
Yeah, so I think we do, as educators, we don't do a really good job of teaching, responsibility necessarily through our curriculum. So for example, I teach an ethical AI course, which has been fascinating. And, I'm teaching it to AI developers. And it's just so interesting how, if you think about the curriculum, a student, they might take ethics, right? But it's not engineering ethics, right? It's Kant. And so as an engineer, I'm like, how in the world am I supposed to apply this? I'm designing a gadget. Like, how do I make this a reality? And so we do need to rethink how we do curriculum and see things. And so, I mean, I have a whole bunch of ideas. In fact, there's an article that was just released about, AI and education and ethics that with my co-author, Jason Borenstein, of how to rethink how we do curriculum so that responsibility, and I'm not going to say necessarily ethics, but responsibility of our role as engineers is permeated throughout the curriculum. It comes with the examples, right? When we're teaching, CAD design, right? Like we say, here, design a box, right? Like here's a design a box, here's the volume, that's how we design. It's like, no. Why don't we say, we're going to design a box that needs to house water units for sub-Saharan Africa, right? Like we can redo this so that as students are thinking about these problem sets and these projects, that it's part of a social system where they also have to think about these issues, about society and injustices and things like that. But as educators, we need to revise. I think is coming. I think is happening. Enough of us are starting to lean in as deans and chairs to say, okay, we're going to fix this.
And yes, we are. Thank you so very much, Dean Howard, for this talk today. So provocative, and it's just opened even more questions. And we would definitely like to, hopefully down the road, maybe bring you back again for some follow-up as you get settled into your new position and role. But again, thank you so very much on behalf of the American Society for Engineering Managers and also UMBC's ECEP. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for participating. Thank you.